Hello, welcome to Worst Case Macchiato, the brand new true crime, supernatural, and conspiracy theory podcast. My name is Vanessa, and I'm here with my co-host Madison.
Hey.
On the podcast, I am going to be talking about some true crime, some paranormal, some myths and legends, some conspiracy theories, kind of just anything that really intrigues me and also has a wild story attached to it.
On this podcast, I will be talking mainly true crime, as it's a passion of mine, but emphasizing more on Canadian true crime as we are located in Canada. A little bit of conspiracy too, but mainly true crime for me.
It's easy for us to talk about true crime in Canada just because we see it more on our news than, other places that have crime going on. Obviously, we see some from the States because, especially me being in Southern Ontario, it's easy for me to kind of connected with northern states. But now that we kind of just went into what we're kind of each going to cover on the podcast, I think it's a good time for some introductions about us. I'm Vanessa. I'm 23 years old. I'm a September Virgo. I graduated with a business diploma back in 2020 at the beginning of COVID, but I am now currently working towards a Bachelor of Arts degree, double majoring in psychology and criminology. Growing up, I was kind of a mixed bag when it came to hobbies. I played a lot of sports, both playing hockey and fast-pitch softball competitively, as well as I played a wide range of school sports, mainly volleyball, rugby, and soccer. But I was also kind of into the arts, so I focused a lot on media art, painting, photography. So even my teachers thought it was really weird that I excelled both in arts and in sports. So, and then, as you probably would have guessed, I've been interested in true crime for as long as I could remember. I remember growing up, I was probably at the earliest between 7 or 8 years old. My mom would always be either watching or having a crime show playing in the background as she was doing chores around the house. And I would always kind of just migrate towards the living room and end up watching it with her. And that fascination kind of just snowballed. I started watching and rewatching documentaries, other movies, docuseries, anything that I could. Now I mostly listen to true crime podcasts or watch YouTube videos, but I do still watch a lot of crime TV shows, rewatching Criminal Minds over and over again, and then watching some of the movies. Currently, I'm watching the TV series Candy, starring Jessica Biel. I'd love to cover that story probably later on in the podcast, but I'm only on episode 3, so we'll see where that goes.
Hi, I'm Madison. I'm 26. I am a June Gemini, not that I really care. I'm not into astrology as much as my co-host here, Vanessa. I am in Eastern Ontario. I grew up playing a lot of sports, just like Vanessa. We played similar sports, played hockey. As soon as I could play hockey, I was playing hockey. I played softball, did a little bit of karate for a while, played a lot of school sports. I graduated from Algonquin College with a Police Foundations diploma back in 2017. I also completed a medical terminology course in 2021. I also did a private investigator course in 2022, and I am currently enrolled in a managers and aspiring leaders course here in 2023. So definitely super high on continued education. I've been interested in true crime for a very long time. Obviously, my goal has always been to work for law enforcement in some sort of capacity. Ideally, I'd love to be a police officer someday, which is kind of where the passion for true crime and things like that stems. And I also mentioned that I'll be covering mainly Canadian true crime, just because I have more of a passion for things that have happened in my country. I don't think that a lot of people know about the crime that happens here, because people don't typically associate Canada with being a place with violent crimes compared to other countries. But my emphasis is definitely on that because I'm very patriotic and definitely want people to know about Canada.
Well, also, when it comes to Canadian true crime, because we have such strict privacy laws, and we still run on the premise of even though they're arrested or they're a criminal, that they deserve their rights to privacy. So a lot of things don't get released. And so anything that you could find, it's not the most extraneous details, so trying to find all those is difficult, but it does need to be talked about so people are still, careful. It's not necessarily the safest country in the world just because we are safer than others, but it's still not extremely safe where you would leave your doors unlocked or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's definitely harder to get information on Canadian true crime because, like you said, we're not like the States in that you can just go and they release crime scene photos and all that stuff. Like, you would never see anything like that in Canada. It's not something that, the public has access to, or it's definitely harder to tell the Canadian true crime stories, but it's definitely interesting and fascinating nonetheless. There's still a lot of details that get released, but just you don't have the copies of all the stuff from the police like other countries give them access to. But
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about how our podcast name kind of came about. My sister's has a lot, Worst Case Ontario, which comes from the Trailer Park Boys. Anybody who's familiar with them would know. Obviously, that can't be a podcast name unless you get rights from the company. So we kind of just put a little spin on it, and we went to Worst Case Macchiato. I'm a fan of the hot macchiatos. Madison is a fan of the iced macchiatos from Starbucks. So it kind of just blended us really well. And it also stayed on the theme of worst case scenarios and kind of keeping that worst case Ontario Trailer Park Boys tidbit kind of alive. So now that we kind of did like a little introduction, I'm going to do a case today just because I'm going to take up the other half of the episode. And I'm going to talk about the Abbotsford Killer. So Abbotsford is in British Columbia. This crime actually occurred on October 13th, 1995, which was Friday the 13th. So I just got to put that out there as well. So it's already kind of bad mojo. So on the night of Friday, October 13th, 16-year-old Misty Cockrell and Tanya Smith were walking behind their high school towards a party when an unfamiliar man broke through a hedge with a baseball bat. And when he jumped out, he ordered the girls to follow him through the bushes back towards a little clearing behind the school surrounded by some houses. So once they got to the clearing, the man ordered the girls to remove all their clothes and to get on the ground. When he ordered this, Tanya complied with his demands, but Misty didn't. She was kind of frozen in fear, but he kind of just ignored Misty for the first little bit, and he started to assault Tanya after telling her to get on the ground. And he was starting to assault her and getting ready to rape her. And he was so focused on Tanya that he put down his bat, and Misty took the opportunity to grab the bat and hit him square across the back to stop him from doing anything further. So at this point, he obviously would get frustrated because he was in the middle of doing something, and he actually told her like, oh, she's gonna regret it and he's gonna kill her and everything like that. So he beats her until she was completely unconscious. And then this is kind of where it went black for Misty. So Misty was unconscious for 4 hours and woke up in the parking lot around the school, and she woke up completely alone. So neither Tanya or the man that attacked them were in sight, and she managed to get up and stumble herself into the hospital. The doctor said that when she stumbled into the hospital, her arm and her finger were broken, and she also had massive skull fractures, and there was a hole the size of a fist in her skull. And
that's insane.
Yeah, and the doctor said they were surprised that she was even alive, let alone being able to like walk around and converse and kind of talk to them before she was rushed. Yeah, before she was rushed into surgery. So it was kind of like, it was almost a miracle that she was able to get herself there. So for the next few days, Misty drifted in and out of consciousness in the hospital. And each time that she was conscious and awake, she would ask about Tanya and ask her if she was all right. But she wasn't given any answers before she lost consciousness again. So this continued for like the next few days. So then 4 days after the attack, when she woke up, she asked about Tanya again. And that's when her parents told her that Tanya's body was found floating in a river, found by a local fisherman, and her body was completely naked. And early that morning after the attack, when she was found face down in the river, they found her clothes kind of spewed in the trees and the bushes on the riverside. It was found in the river called the Vedder River, Vedder, and that the coroner said that she actually died from drowning. So he threw her into the river while she was awake. They said that he beat her so severely that she probably would have succumbed to her injuries, but her actual cause of death was drowning. And then a week after the attack, Misty described to sketch artists that the attacker was approximately 6 feet tall, had a slim build, was white, and was in his mid-30s. So that is just the base of the original attack that this Abbotsford Killer did. So now I'm going to go into the investigation a bit, because he kind of pulled, a 1970s serial killer move where he was taunting the police a lot. So as soon as the attack and murder happened, it was all over the local news, and the attacker was officially named the Abbotsford Killer. And then following the attack, the killer made 4 calls on the same day. So the first call, he claimed that he was the one to find Misty and helped her to the hospital. And then without identifying himself, he hung up. And because it was such a short call, he couldn't be traced. And then on the second call, he gave details of Smith's body that weren't released to the public, such as the bite marks that were found on Tanya's right breast. So this call was actually traced to a payphone at the local arena. And even though there was a very short response time of the first responders to get to the payphone area, he was no longer there, but they said that it was very likely that he probably was sitting in their car when they went up to the payphone, or he was driving out of the parking lot as the first responders were coming in. For that phone call, the police searched the area for any evidence, bloodstains, fingerprints, but they couldn't find anything. So he was very careful and very meticulous. For the third phone call, he calls a couple hours after they're done kind of sweeping the area, and he mocks the police and laughs at their inability to catch him, saying, "Do you think I would be stupid enough to leave fingerprints behind when I make a phone call?" So obviously this frustrated police, because obviously anytime you do anything and you don't get any evidence, it's frustrating to be able to move forward with the investigation. So then for the final call for that day, he calls the police and tells them that he was looking for new victims and that he couldn't wait to kill again. And on this point, the telecommunication companies were working with the police, and they created a method of tracing calls that would allow the telecommunication companies to trace where the call is coming from before a first responder even picked up the call in the first place. But even though they were able to quickly get to the location, he still was able to leave before they arrived on site ever. So he was never caught at any of the payphones he ever called from.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's like, and obviously payphones aren't like a huge thing anymore, but like this was 1995, so they were kind of all over the place.
Yeah, they were kind of everywhere, right? Like back then, cell phones were not really very portable like they are today. Obviously, there's still payphones out there, but very few and far between. So
yeah, usually they're like at like shopping malls or something like that, right? So
yeah, like if I think of like where I live, I think like off the top of my head, I can think of where there's 3 in the entire area. Obviously, it's not a big area, but yeah, there's like only 3, and like one is outside of our Walmart, and then the other 2 would be in our 2 local hockey rinks. But other than that, I don't think there's any others in the area whatsoever.
The last time I remember seeing a payphone was on an Easter scavenger hunt with Melissa's side of the family. And we were doing like a scavenger hunt, like we had to go around town and find these things and take pictures with it. And that was the last time I think I remember seeing a payphone. So it's kind of just, I know like from watching Criminal Minds and stuff, like if somebody, because each payphone obviously has a phone number, so people can call that payphone and talk to somebody who's there if needed. It's kind of funny how that works. But
yeah, I didn't even know that was like a thing, to be honest. Like I have never looked at a payphone and been like, oh, this is the number for this payphone if somebody wants to call it back. I didn't know that was a thing, actually, to be honest, until today. So learn something new every day, I guess.
Yeah, I just remember for Criminal Minds when my Criminal Minds lovers obviously will understand what I mean here, but when Spencer Reid was in a relationship with Maeve, she was in a situation where she was like attacked by like a psycho stalker, right? So she was kind of like hiding herself, but like he would call her from a payphone and immediately hang up, so she had the number, and then she would call back the payphone. And it's so weird that you can get like a phone number from a payphone. Like I never knew until Criminal Minds that you could do that.
Right? I know. Yeah, no, I haven't finished Criminal Minds, to be honest, so I'm a little slacking on that part. So
I just have to keep waiting for it to come out on a streaming service.
fair. I honestly thought it was done. Like I didn't realize it was still actively running, to be honest.
Well, I think they just finally uploaded the last season to Disney Plus, but they started a spin-off, but it's not everyone from the original crew, so like Spencer Reid's not on the new one.
Yeah, I did hear about that just the other day, actually, which is why we were talking about Criminal Minds the other day.
So after these 4 phone calls on the same day, probably a week after the attack, roughly, Tanya's family had the funeral for her, and at the time, The family and the investigators didn't know it, but the killer actually attended this funeral and he brought with him his 2 children. And then a few weeks after the attack on Halloween, the killer called the police for the 5th time, explaining in full detail what he had done to Tanya. And obviously, I'm not going to reiterate that because it is pretty, like, gruesome and everything like that. And he also explained what he would do to his next victim. Again, he called from a payphone, which when they arrived to it, he was no longer there. But then they later found out from talking with him after they caught him that he was actually watching them from a nearby diner when they were going to the payphone. So he was watching them.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's pretty ballsy.
Yeah, like he sat there and watched. I think I didn't write it in my notes, but I think on the first day he admitted to staying in the parking lot and was watching them from the parking lot. So he was extremely arrogant in that he wouldn't be caught ever, and he definitely thought that he was a lot smarter than the police.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely obviously seems that way, but if I was him, I would have been gone and you would not have seen me again.
Yeah, right?
I
Like,
would have been out of that area so freaking quick.
yeah, like that would be my
Oh.
instinct too. Like, I definitely do not want to be even in the remote area when they come around.
Like, I wouldn't like take off running out of the area because that would look suspicious, but I definitely would not be sticking around.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I'm surprised that if there were cars in the parking lot though or anything like that, like they wouldn't talk to them. But I mean, maybe that's just me. But
Yeah.
so then in early November, shortly after this 5th phone call, the police officially released little tidbits of the phone calls to the public, hoping someone would recognize the voice. But nobody ever came forward about it. But through the release of these phone calls, Misty was able to identify that the voice of the caller was the man who attacked them that night. So they were able to get a positive confirmation from Misty. So from there, they knew that it wasn't just someone pranking them about it. And then in early December, the police arrested a man who they believed was a dead ringer for the composite sketch, and the man willingly provides a DNA sample and the dental imprint because of the bite on her breast, but both of these came back negative. And over the course of December all the way to February, they had 4 other suspects that came in, and all of their tests came back negative as well. From then on, they're just like, okay, well, this is a dead case. Like, no one's recognizing the voice, so we have like nowhere to turn at this point. That was until February 17th, 1996, the next year. The killer went to the graveyard and stole Tanya's gravestone from the cemetery. And on the day that he took the gravestone, he made 2 phone calls that day. So he first called the radio station, which Abbotsford only had 1 at the time. And he told them to look outside because he left them a gift. So so the radio station looked at the window and they saw Tanya's gravestone on one of their news vans. And he, over the picture of Tanya that was put onto the gravestone, the killer wrote threats and profanities in pen all over it, just to like disrespect it even more, right?
Like he hadn't done enough already.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because you already done enough. You assaulted her, killed her, but let's just write threats all over her gravestone too. You know, it's like, why not just stop at murder? And so he later called the police from a payphone again, but this time it was only a couple blocks away from the police station, and he asked them if they liked his gift of the gravestone. Nothing ever came of this, but then a couple days later, a wrench was thrown through the window of a family who had no connection to the case or connection to the Smith and Cockrell families. So this was a completely random house that he threw a wrench through the window. And wrapped around the wrench, he had a note taped to it, and it mentioned 3 other assaults that he claimed that he did and he wanted credit for. And on this note, which, because I'm so, worried about grammar and everything all the time, this note was apparently typed with no punctuation at all. So
that would have really made you mad.
oh yeah, I was like, okay, well, this person, like I don't know what's going on, but maybe they didn't have the best education, right? Like, that's what they got from that. So then the forensic expert dusted the wrench and taped for fingerprints, where they couldn't find anything that was visible to the naked eye, but the experts weren't completely content with not being able to get anything at all, so they also looked with a microscope, and they found the most faint index fingerprint that it was almost impossible to find. So they had to do some like reprinting onto like engrave it into something so they could actually get a proper read of what the fingerprint even looked like. But this fingerprint that was lifted wasn't a match in any Canadian database, and it also wasn't in America's FBI national database, which means that this killer did not have a criminal record prior to this attack.
Or, I mean, he could have had a criminal record, it just there was no systems in place that involve fingerprinting process or anything like that. Because back in that time, like they didn't fingerprint for every single offense, and they still to this day don't fingerprint for every single offense. So
That's true.
if I'm like super minor stuff, like sometimes they'll just kind of catch and release, and if they don't end up doing jail time, usually they won't. But I think for the most part, everything does mostly now, but there are I know of some instances where they don't.
Yeah,
So
at this time, they just suspected that he probably was either a first time offender or he had a very, minor rap sheet. Maybe like stealing things here or there or vandalism or something, but nothing to the extent of, assaulting people. And then finally, in May of 1996, the police officers finally got a lead after they received a call from the assailant's brother and his mother that recognized his voice. And so in May 1996, 31-year-old Terry Driver was finally arrested and was charged with Tanya's rape and murder, as well as the attempted murder of Misty. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about who Terry Driver kind of was. I only have a little bit about him because there wasn't a ton of information out there. As far as I know, he didn't really complete very many interviews about it because in trial he completely denied that it was like premeditated and everything. So Terry Driver was born January 25th, 1965. He's an Aquarius for people that care, and his parents were Audrey and Grant Driver. His father was a police officer with the Vancouver Police Department, and because his father was a cop, Terry actually had an extreme obsession with police scanners all throughout his life because he was just used to hearing the police scanner all the time because of his dad. It was noted that he was an extremely hyperactive child, and he was diagnosed with a minor brain abnormality at just 2 years old, and he had to spend his school years within group care. With him having to spend school years in group care, that also plays back to the fact that his thing was written without any punctuation, spelling things wrong and such like that, because he didn't have the best school experience or a normal school experience. At age 12, Driver was diagnosed with Tourette's, which for people who don't know is a neurological disorder that results in nervous tics, which can be auditory, physical, or both. And he also had obsessive compulsive behaviors, which also plays into Tourette's as well. Later on in life, Driver married his wife Val, and they had 2 children, and these are the 2 children that attended Tanya's funeral with him. And that was pretty much everything I had on Terry. There wasn't anything else very much on him, but I did have a little tidbit here from an interview that they had with Val after Terry was arrested. So she noted that when she was 32, she married Terry, but she had never been in a relationship prior. So Terry was her first ever boyfriend, husband. And she said that the marriage to him ruined her entire life. So her children, after he was arrested, were taken from her and they were put into foster care. And she also stated that she never saw the attack coming and that she was shunned from both her and Terry's family as well as from the community after she was arrested. So obviously like negative connotations, right?
yeah, for sure. That's crazy that she faced that kind of backlash when she had no idea on any of it, for sure. But yeah, I could see how that could ruin her life.
Yeah, and I'm not sure the exact reason on why she would have lost her kids. I just know that they did. Maybe she wasn't financially fit to take care of them afterwards. I'm not exactly sure. I couldn't even find what Terry's job was, so or like if he was working at all. So I don't really know what exactly happened with that. I just know that her kids were taken from her.
Yeah, I mean, like back then too, kids were taken a lot. It didn't take much to take kids back then versus nowadays. But yeah, I don't know. Obviously, police would have had to have some sort of thing to take them, but I'm not sure on that one.
Yeah, like the only thing I could think of maybe she wasn't financially fit. Like that would be like maybe the only thing for me. Like because if she didn't abuse them or whatever, like letting your husband take the kids every once in a while, like to go out somewhere, no one would think twice about that. Unless she had mental issues as well, where she wasn't fit alone to take care of children, maybe. But I don't know. There wasn't much about either of them because it is also like a recent case too. Like they can't just release anything because of privacy reasons.
Yeah, like that's one thing with Canadian cases is, there's a lot of information that doesn't get released to the public, so it does make talking about Canadian cases a little tougher because you don't have access to things that, the States gives access to as far as cases go. Like in the States, you can look up crime scene pictures like that. All that stuff kind of gets released, or a lot of the documents get released, where that's not a thing in Canada. Like as much as they're criminals, like their rights are protected, and the public doesn't have access to a lot of those files. Like if unless you're a victim of the family, you might get access to some, but for the most part, even families don't get a whole lot of info on the whole situation.
Yes, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about the trial, just because, like I said, he didn't say that it was premeditated or he didn't think that he was, like it was kind of like a reactionary thing. That's what he claimed. So, upon arrest, they took DNA samples. They took his fingerprints, obviously, and then also a dental imprint, and all three came back positive. And then there was also the phone call identification from both of his parents and Misty as well, so they knew it was the same person. Even though he had some mental issues, his lawyers never claimed that it was an insanity. Like, they never did any insanity plea or anything like that. But they did note that he had Tourette's, OCD, and ADD, and claimed that the mix of his disorders and the medications he was supposed to take for them led him to falsely admit to the crimes over the phone and in person with the police. Which, anyone who knows anything about Tourette's and OCD, like an ADD, that doesn't mean that you would say that you would do that, and that doesn't spark you to be aggressive like that. Because OCD is a compulsive thing, like it's a lot of doing things X number of times, or being super awareness of health and doing things to protect your health and stuff like that, not a compulsive need to consistently hurt other people. Like that's a very rare case that would ever happen. And then obviously Tourette's doesn't play in the role of admitting to anything like that either. So because of these reasons as well, the judge didn't really take into account all those disorders and everything that the lawyers for the defense team claimed. But the defense team also requested to move the trial to a different location, as they were saying that it was going to be an unfair trial because everyone that is on the jury and the judge and everything like that would be heavily influenced, which obviously it happens all the time. These all were also requested a lot for cases where they think that racism is going to occur and sexism as well, and that kind of stuff. But the judge refused the move, and he ended up convicting Driver of murder in the first degree for Tanya's death, and was convicted for the attempted murder of Misty, and the court officially declared him as a dangerous offender. So the judge gave him a mandatory life sentence, which he appealed, but he lost that appeal in 2001, and he was imprisoned in the Kent Institution, located on the border of British Columbia and Yukon. The Kent Institution is the only federal maximum security prison on the Pacific Coast in Canada. In 2006, upon request by Driver and his lawyers, Driver was moved back to Abbotsford and put into the Pacific Institution Regional Treatment Center. So he was moved back to the town where he committed these crimes, and also back into the town where Misty was still residing. So she stayed in Abbotsford, and I looked her up on LinkedIn and everything, and she still lives in Abbotsford. So she never left. But Convictions Canada came under huge scrutiny for this move, which to me, rightfully so, on him moving back to the area because he committed the crimes there, and Misty, a victim he tried to kill but didn't, she's still living there. It kind of just reminds me of the Paul Bernardo case that we're going to talk about later on, where he was just moved to the same area that Homolka lives. Now he's in the same province as her again. It just doesn't make sense. Like,
Yeah, and he was moved from like a supermax to a medium security prison, which was obviously scrutinized, and Corrections Canada just announced that it is an okay move and they're okay with it. So he'll be moving to medium security facility, which is crazy to me considering what he did. So, but we'll get into that in another episode.
yeah. So he was moved to a treatment center instead because of the disorders I talked about earlier. And so then on August 23rd, 2021, Driver actually died of natural causes in the treatment center at the age of 56. And then obviously the families of Misty and Tanya were all extremely relieved that he is no longer a threat, no longer in the area, and no longer could hurt anybody else. And I think like the direct quote that they used in like the title of some of these journal articles that they did was that Misty said, "He's no longer a problem for me." And just to round up the story a little bit, the last update I have for Misty, because I didn't really get any background story on Tanya and Misty, but Misty, since she's still alive, I do know what she's doing now just because she's on LinkedIn. So following the attacks, she ended up becoming an outreach worker for victims of serious crime after graduating with a Bachelor of Arts at the University of Fraser Valley in British Columbia. So then she was the outreach worker for victims of serious crimes for 2 years
before being a support worker for drug and alcohol recovery. And then she moved on to being a public speaker for trauma, victimization, and resilience, which led her to the job that she officially has now, which is to be a regional mental health and wellness liaison for the First Nations Health Authority. So she's very much stayed in helping victims who can't really help themselves at the moment and trying to help people get back on their feet. And I think that like this is a really good move for her because she can relate to these people personally.
So yeah, definitely something that she would obviously have first-hand experience in, sadly. But
Yeah, and obviously like this case ever since I really found out about it, it's kind of sparks me a lot because and like it frustrates me a lot because I remember like growing up like me and my sister would leave the house at like 11 p.m. midnight and like Savannah would walk around with her friends for hours. I can only imagine somebody jumping out of a bush and doing like that to anybody who's just like, walking around. And at that point like we were like 14, 15, right? Like so we were the exact same ages as Misty and Tanya were, and it's just scary how fast things can happen like that.
yeah, I was gonna say like this crime happened in what we said 95.
Yeah, 95.
Yeah, so like this happened the year that my brother was born. So my brother's the oldest of us as cousins, and he was sentenced in what 97 was it?
96.
96. So I wasn't even born. Not, we weren't born when this happened, but yeah, it's just crazy to think like things that we did just freely without a care in the world, and to think like this could have happened to anybody. Really, this could happen to anybody, but yeah, it's just crazy.
Yeah, and like nowadays it's much more like not normal to allow your child to walk to a friend's house or to, go out and walk around alone and everything like that. But even when we were growing up, even though it wasn't like super long ago, my parents allowed us to go to the park alone. We were allowed to walk to our friend's house. We walked across town because like obviously Orangeville wasn't that big either. We would walk across town to go to school, and nothing ever really, at least that I know of, really happened in Orangeville for them to think that like that wasn't okay with doing. But I don't know very many parents now who would let their 12-year-old daughter walk down the street or across town anymore. Like it,
Yeah, it's definitely not something that like happens as frequently as it would have like when we were growing up. Like obviously my nephew, he's not old enough for school yet, but because there's a school so close to where they live, at 6 they start walking. But I'm like, if your parents are at work, like having a 6-year-old walk a few blocks to school like on their own, like that's sketchy, right? So yeah, I don't know even there's not even that many kids that walk to school alone now. Like parents or grandparents will walk with them to make sure that they get there because you just truly never know in today's day and age who's out there and who's watching.
yeah, exactly. Like driving around the city right now is absolutely horrible. Well, not like right now because it's summer, but because there's so many schools around here, and the pickup zone lines are like it goes all the way up the street, and you're like, oh my gosh, like I just want to go past because I want to get Tim Hortons. Please, like just let me by. But like that was completely unheard of at like my schools growing up. Like very few parents ever would pick up their kids. Either they were bused or they would walk home, or they would have a babysitter that would walk them home, or they would have an older sibling or an older cousin or a neighbor who would walk them home. Like it was never like very few people ever got picked up from school unless like it was a no bus day and parents drove their kids on purpose.
Yeah.
So that was the whole story of the Abbotsford Killer. It wasn't a super long case. It only kind of went over the course of 8 months, so it wasn't a super long time for it to be cold for them. I thought that this would be a good case to kind of just start on, just because it reiterates how quickly things can happen and how it could happen to anybody at any time. And it's kind of the reason why I wanted to start a podcast as well, because these people deserve justice. Like Tanya deserves to be talked about. She deserves to be known because he stole a life from her. She didn't get to fulfill her life while this guy decided that he was the one that should take it away from her. And I just think that he had the audacity to also disrupt her deathbed by taking her gravestone and vandalizing it. Like it was just he couldn't do anything more disrespectful to the family and to Tanya after
Like her
he already
her
killed her.
being gone wasn't enough for him, like it's pretty
Yeah,
crazy, but
and all these phone calls he talked about what he did to her multiple times. and like he would make fun of the police for still not being able to catch him. And it's just scary to know that if his parents and his brother were like super loyal to him and didn't, you know, turn him in and refused to believe that it was him, like he could have went on to kill more people and assault more people, which is so scary to me, because who knows how many voice recordings that are out there that people like haven't said that they know the person from, and they've gone on to kill way more people than they should have.
Yeah, no, for sure.
I think honestly that's probably a good place to end the episode. We're gonna have 2 different cases next week, and so it won't just be everyone listening to my voice. You get to hear a little bit from Madison, and get to hear the case that she gets to talk about, and you get to hear her viewpoints on a lot of the crimes for that crime that she wants to do. And so thank you so much for listening to our podcast. If you wish to continue following us on our podcasting journey, you can follow us on Instagram at @worstcase_macchiato. If you want to get in contact with us to do a case suggestion, or to just tell us about something we missed, or even possibly an update on a case, you can either DM us on Instagram or email us at worstcasemacchiato@gmail.com.
See all you guys next week.
On Worst Case Macchiato.